Okay, maybe we can start with a bit of introductions and housekeeping. Welcome to the session, everyone. And my name is Elif Gündüzyeli. I work for Climate Action Network Europe as a Senior Energy Policy Coordinator. And firstly, thank you for taking the time and being in the virtual press conference. A bit of housekeeping first. This conference is being recorded, and we aim to share with you the recording as well later on. So that is the point. And we aim to make this as much as we can as an in-person press conference, press meeting. So please be active, and if you can turn on your videos, it would be great to also see faces. And if you can also rename yourselves at the moment on Zoom with your names and the name of your organizations, media agencies, so that we're more comfortable. We have done that from our side, so hopefully you see our names as name and organization. So yes, I'm the moderator of this conference today. And let me give a bit of an explanation about what is happening now and why we're doing this. So as you're mostly aware, we're waiting for the Fit for 55 package, which is a comprehensive package of policies and measures to deliver on the European Green Deal objectives. This is planned to be launched by mid-July. This legislative package is meant to serve the EU climate ambition to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 in order to achieve climate neutrality in 2050. But given the extent of the climate crisis we're in, we all believe that EU legislation must be designed to enable the total package, so the package that will be launched, to overshoot the 55% target and fulfill the EU's commitment to the Paris Agreement, to do its fair share to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The revision of the very outdated energy taxation directive is also part of this package. And when I say outdated, it means the ETD, the energy taxation directive, dates back from 2003, and it couldn't get revised until now. So at the moment, it gets a bit less public attention as a part of the package, but this is a key file which will determine the fate of fossil fuel subsidies in the European Union, as exemptions from taxes make the fossil fuel industry keep billions of euros in their pockets. And this press conference now marks the kickoff of a long breath campaign for a meaningful and ambitious revision of the energy taxation directive, with a joint statement. So now Dave will paste the statement in the chat box. So this joint statement is led by ClientEarth and our Fish, and signed by over 30 NGOs and business associations, including Can Europe and the organizations of the experts who will speak in this press conference later on. But please keep in mind that this is under embargo until Monday. So I would like to walk you through the program, if this is fine. Oh, sorry, I just opened the wrong, yeah, okay, the program. So we will now have three presentations, respectively firstly by Tim Gore, head of the Low Carbon and Circular Economy program at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. He will give an overview of the energy taxation directive. And then we will move on with Flaminia Tacconi, EU fisheries lawyer from ClientEarth, who will speak about the importance of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies for fishing vessels to protect the ocean. And finally, we will have Peter Wouters, Senior Director of Energy from International Institute for Sustainable Development, to speak about the extent of fossil fuel subsidies in Europe and how EU action to end fossil fuel subsidies can influence progress on the issue at the global level. Just to say that if you have questions while the presenters are speaking, you can either type them in the chat box or you can keep them to ask the questions by the end of the presentations in the Q&A session. So now I leave the floor to Tim.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'll just give a quick overview of some of the key issues in the Energy Taxation Directive as part of the background to the statement that Elif referred to earlier. The first thing to say is that the vast majority of fossil fuel subsidies in the EU take the form of tax expenditures. So that means forms of tax exemption or lower tax rates. And most of those are related to the Energy Taxation Directive, and they amount to about 35 billion euros per year, which across the EU, which is nearly 4 times more than the tax expenditures for renewables. And as Elif said, this is a very old directive dating all the way back to 2003. And the intention of the objective of the directive was to set minimum tax rates for energy products, so for heating and transport fuels and for electricity, in order to avoid competitive distortions in the single market. Well, number of problems with it. First of all, those minimum tax rates were never indexed, so they've never changed. They're still the same numbers that were set in 2003, which means that in real terms, they've actually declined. And therefore, even with the primary objective of the directive to harmonize tax rates, it's not working. We've seen a huge fragmentation of tax rates across the EU. But even more importantly than that, those rates are set with absolutely no relationship to the carbon content of fuels. There's really no logic to them at all, other than that they were designed to try to reflect the international competitiveness of prices in those particular fuels back in 2003. And even worse, the directive is a Swiss cheese directive, is absolutely full of loopholes, exemptions, and flexibilities for member states to set lower tax rates, in particular related to fossil fuels. And this is the source of all of these fossil fuel subsidies in the EU. Next slide, please. So just to give you a flavor of some of the peculiarities, therefore, of the energy tax regime in Europe today, we find, for example, with regard to heating and electricity, that coal is taxed at a lower rate than gas, so coal being more polluting and yet has a lower tax rate than gas. Well, there are still a number of households, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, that rely on coal heating for their homes. Perhaps even more significantly, gas is taxed less than electricity. And given that one of the biggest challenges for decarbonisation in Europe over the next decade is to electrify heating, to really scale up hugely the installation of heat pumps in houses across Europe, then the fact that it's still taxed at a higher rate, electricity for heating, than gas, is obviously making that much more difficult. And for both gas, well, the other thing to say is that electricity tax rates don't distinguish at all between where the source of that electricity. So there's no distinction between taxing electricity that comes from renewables versus from fossil fuels. And for both gas and electricity, industry is taxed significantly less than households, and that's particularly the case for energy-intensive industry. So for those of you that follow the debate on the emissions trading scheme and the free allowances, well, actually the exemptions for energy-intensive industries under the ETD are just as, if not more significant than the free allowances that are available under the ETS. So there's a big concern there as well. And then when we come to transport, again, we see a number of peculiarities. So diesel, which is more polluting, is taxed less than petrol across the EU, and in particular, commercial diesel pays even lower tax rates. So this means, in particular, the road haulage industry, the big trucks, but it also means, for example, company cars, and anybody that's been based in Brussels and understands the problem of tax incentives for company cars, highly polluting, big cause of local air pollution. This is where it comes from. It's all related to the Energy Taxation Directive. Also, that would involve diesel use in intensive agriculture, for example, and taxis and a number of other uses. And perhaps the most egregious, though, of all of the tax exemptions under the ETD, of course, is that aviation and shipping pay no tax at all. So they're exempt entirely. And remember that for aviation, this is the most unequal form of carbon consumption. So it's the majority of emissions, the majority of flights are taken by a small minority of Europeans, and yet there's no tax on the fuel for that at all. So the total subsidy for aviation is somewhere between 8 and nearly 14 billion euros per year alone. And of course, this introduces all sorts of strange distortions in the market. So we should be incentivizing moving both people and freight around Europe by lower carbon transport means. But actually, that isn't the way that the tax incentives are set up. You know, there's nothing that, in fact, you might get more encouraging tax rates for diesel, road haulage and aviation than you'll get for rail, for example, which makes no sense at all. And these are just a picture of the comparison of the tax rates for electricity and gas between industry and households at the end of 2020. Next slide, please. So finally, for me, what's taken so long? If this directive doesn't seem to make much sense in the context of the EU's climate goals, why do we still have it all these years later? As Elif mentioned, there was an attempt to revise this directive back in 2011, and eventually in 2015, the Commission withdrew the proposal. Why was that? Well, it got killed by a combination of industry lobbying and the unanimity principle. So bear in mind, this is a tax file, so it's governed by unanimity in the Council. The Parliament actually gave a positive opinion on the revision, but it only has an advisory role. And so behind all of those tax exemptions was a different industry lobby that mobilized to defend the loopholes that they benefited from, and it didn't get very far. So what's going to be different this time? Well, you might think that it's got even less chance of passing in light of the yellow vests protests in France. And obviously it is the case that increases in energy taxes, particularly in home heating and road transport, they are regressive. But it's not to say that yellow vests are inevitable. And we know that depending on how revenues are spent, the overall tax reform can be progressive and can direct resources from richer, higher emitting households to poorer, lower emitting ones. I think the other really important thing here is that this is going to be part of a package deal, the Fit for 55 package, as Elif mentioned. That gives more opportunities for trade-offs between the different areas that might help it to pass. And the other thing I think that's really important here is that there's a lot of movement on tax. We've seen the proposals from the US Biden administration for a minimum corporate tax rate, which is a total game changer. And just last week, we saw an agreement finally on country by country public reporting across EU member states as well. So things are moving on tax in a way that they haven't before. So it does seem like the stars could align for a new grand bargain on fair green tax reform that can really establish a more comprehensive carbon price across Europe. And it can be done in a way that helps to tackle inequalities in Europe as well. So that's it from me as an introduction, and I hand back to Elif.
Thank you so much, Tim. So Tim has walked us through the ETD, but also emphasized that it's the polluters who are not paying at the moment with the existing energy taxation regime, so that the review can give a way to change that balance. And so it is not only the major polluters polluting the climate and the environment by emitting carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, but also they have impacts on biodiversity. And now I'll give the floor to Flaminia Tacconi from ClientEarth. She's an EU fisheries lawyer to speak about the importance of eliminating these subsidies for fishing vessels to protect the ocean. Flaminia.
Thank you, Elif. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I will walk you through why the elimination of fossil fuel in fisheries is a triple win. Maybe before starting, I will point out that among the areas that or the ones that benefit from tax exemption is also not only shipping but also fisheries. So fishers are the ones who pay absolutely zero tax on fuel. And we consider that, so elimination of fossil fuel in fisheries is a triple win, because getting rid of the subsidies helps fighting climate change, it helps keep the ocean teeming with life, and it also tilts the playing field back in favor of the small-scale fishing industry, that we all want to support. And this is maybe the more tricky part. So I will explain why. So taxation of fuel fisheries can end a destructive fishing practices, which are destructive not only from a biodiversity perspective, but also from a climate change perspective. And this has been pointed out more strongly with a recent study by Enric Sala that shows that fishing boats that trawl the ocean floor release as much carbon dioxide as the entire aviation industry each year. And this was not proven, not yet. Bottom trawling is a widespread practice in which heavy nets are dragged along the seabed, and that pumps out 1 gigaton of carbon every year, says the study written by the 26 marine biologists, climate experts, and economists. And the carbon is released from the seabed sediment into the water and can increase actually ocean acidification, as well as adversely affecting productivity and biodiversity. And the marine sediments are the largest store of organic carbon in the world. And these are new findings from a carbon emission perspective. But not only does carbon get released from trawling the sea floor, but directly through the emission from fishing vessel and the extraction, so the real activity of taking out the fish from the sea. And another scientific study from Mariana found that because fish sequester carbon in the deep ocean when they sink, basically overfishing them has led to a massive amount of this blue carbon contributing to additional CO2 emissions. And they found that ocean fisheries have released a minimum of 0.73 billion metric tons of CO2 in the atmosphere since 1950. So it's quite important to reduce this destructive fishing practices if we want to tackle climate change. And limiting blue carbon extraction by fisheries would reduce CO2 emissions by burning less fuel and reactivating a natural carbon pump through the rebuilding of fish stock and the increase of fish sinking. But fuel subsidies, which are also understood as indirect subsidies, like the fuel exemption included in the current ETD, have been long considered by economists and fisheries experts as very detrimental for not only an environmental perspective, but also from an economic and social perspective. And that's the tricky bit in fisheries, that basically fuel subsidies in fisheries artificially lower operating costs and distort the ocean economy, fueling destructive and uneconomic fishing practices. The previous study I mentioned that looked at the carbon impact on global fishing also combined their analysis with subsidies, and they found that on a global scale, 43.5% of the blue carbon extracted by fisheries in the high seas come from areas that would be economically unprofitable without subsidies. So fuel subsidies fuel overfishing, and overfishing fuels climate change and biodiversity loss. So eliminating fuel subsidies would strengthen fish stock resilience to climate change and help restore ecosystem and enhance carbon sequestration, without forgetting that the role of the ocean in the climate change crisis is fundamental, because basically it's a climate regulator. Then comes the part that has more to do with the economic and social aspects of the fishery sector, and it's that the fuel subsidies disproportionately benefit larger, polluting and more destructive fishing fleets, leaving the small-scale, low-impact fishers with depleted fishing grounds. We analyzed the last economic report of the Commission of the EU fishing fleet, and we have discovered that in the EU, the small-scale coastal fleet, which represents 56% of the total days at sea, consumes only 6% of fuel. And in comparison, the EU distant fishing fleet accounts for less than 2 fishing days at sea, but consumes 16.5% of the fuel. And we also analyzed the prognosis of the economic impact of eliminating the fuel tax exemptions in the EU fishing fleet, which is a study made by the Joint Research Center of the Commission. And it shows that the small scale fleet would also be the best place to adapt to an elimination of those fuel subsidies through the ETD revision, which gives hope that this change would benefit both the environment and the coastal communities that are so important for the EU, and that would offer these fishers and these areas more opportunities with the appropriate support through other funds and mechanisms. Fuel subsidies support, therefore, the economic marginalization of small-scale low-impact fisheries, and harmful fisheries subsidies must be repurposed to protect and support their livelihoods. And existing funds and social schemes should also be used to ensure a just transition where this transition is needed. Finally, I will tackle also something that has to do with the international movement around fisheries subsidies. Maintaining fuel subsidies in the fisheries sector is actually inconsistent with EU internal and international commitments on climate and biodiversity. Fuel subsidies increase carbon emission and support the destruction of marine ecosystems. And actually, at WTO level, there is a commitment to eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies. And fuel subsidies are not only one of the most common fisheries subsidies, but they're also estimated to be the largest of globally. And fuel tax exemption are considered a subsidy under the Article 1 of the Agreement of Subsidies and Countervailing Measures of the WTO. And although the current ETD requires the application for fuel exemption in the fishery sector, so it's an obligation to have these fuel exemptions, with the revision of the ETD, this would be the perfect window of opportunity to eliminate fuel subsidies, both at EU and international level. And if the ETD proposal follows the guidelines, the political guidelines given by the EU Green Deal, then the ETD will become a tool to achieve climate change and fuel exemption will not be granted anymore. But this position must be defended already now at WTO level. And that's the issue, is that the EU, for the moment, is not leading by example and actually is playing a negative role in those international negotiations, while we consider that it should steer the WTO away from fuel subsidies. So to sum up, by eliminating fuel exemption in the ETD and possibly through the WTO negotiation, also other harmful subsidies in fisheries, the EU would take a much needed step. It would allow the EU fishing sector to adopt the necessary adjustment to decrease its negative impact on climate change and marine environment by using less destructive fishing practices, which are also less fuel consuming, so are also interesting from an emission point of view, but also move away from being a subsidies dependent sector and become, and it would allow EU fisheries to become an economic viable sector, ensuring that coastal communities thrive, while EU sustainable fish products are provided to EU consumers. That would be it from my side. So I'll pass the floor back to Elif. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Flaminia. So Flaminia has put the context looking into the fisheries and impacts on the ocean, has also taken the ecosystem approach, and which has a global level importance. So we're not talking about the EU only anymore when we go broader than the individual sectors, but going out to the seas, oceans as an example as well. And Flaminia also mentioned about EU's potential leading role in the WTO level. But I would add that it's not the only international venue that EU can lead on. There's also the G7 and G20 debates around fossil fuel subsidy phase out. So now I would like to leave the floor to Peter Wouters. He's a senior director in the energy sector at International Institute for Sustainable Development. And Peter will speak about the extent of fossil fuel subsidies in Europe and how EU action to end fossil fuel subsidies can influence progress on the issue at global level. So, Peter.
Thanks very much, Elif. One simple graph here, just to show that often when we think about fossil fuel subsidies, we think they're somewhere else. We think about it's developing countries selling gasoline cheap to their population. It's Chinese coal mining, it's major oil and gas producers in the US, in the Middle East, in Russia, who are subsidized as well. Yes, they are, but then the EU is as well. And this graph here is taken from a recently launched product by the OECD and by my organization, the IISD, called fossilfuelsubsidytracker.org. And what this does is it takes the national estimates that have been made by the intergovernmental organizations, so the OECD, the IIEA, and the IMF, and collates them in one place. And why we think this is useful is, often people will say, oh, we don't have definitions for subsidies, we don't have reliable figures. Well, there is now a website here, fossilfuelsubsidytracker.org, which shows for each country of the world estimates of fossil fuel subsidies in each of those countries. They're split into coal, electricity, natural gas, and petroleum products. And this is the sort of summation of the numbers that we've got there for the European Union's 27 member states. Some of these subsidies are because of the EU tax directive and other EU policies, others are member state policies. But you can see from the figure here that while a lot of the attention in the EU is often about the coal subsidies that Spain, Germany, and Poland still give, that's only 5 billion euros of the total. The vast majority, about 2/3, is petroleum products, so various forms of oil sector subsidies. We can look at examples. Belgium rebates diesel and other fuels for customers, including taxis, including freight, and including the residential sector. Italy and Sweden have a reduced rate of tax for diesel in motor vehicles. And France has a whole range of provisions, and as do many other EU member states who are subsidizing oil with a variety of mechanisms. And they're also subsidizing natural gas. You'll see there another 3 billion plus in the EU. So they're subsidizing things that are acting against climate change in particular. And again, a recent piece of work that my organization, IISD, did looked at what would happen if subsidies were reformed across the world. We looked at 32 countries, and we found that if they reformed their fossil fuel subsidies, they would, on average, save 6% of their greenhouse gas emissions at a stroke. And that's something that would both save them 6% of their greenhouse gas emissions, but also you've got the option there of you've got some more public expenditure to make. And if some of that were diverted back into clean energy, so we did a scenario that said, if you take 30% of the fossil fuel subsidies and swap it into clean energy investment, you then move from an average of 6% savings up to 10% savings. So there's some extremely attractive and significant savings in greenhouse gas emissions to be done with fossil fuel subsidy reform at a negative cost to governments. And you think, well, why aren't countries doing it more? And I think if we look at the sort of current situation, we're very used, I think, to seeing the European Union and the Commission as a leader in climate ambition and in actions, but we haven't seen this from the bloc, the EU 27 bloc, on fossil fuel subsidy reform yet. We haven't seen it in the EU, and we haven't seen it abroad in the international processes that Elif mentioned, the G7, G20, UNFCCC, and others. And the European Green Deal, I think, gives us the starting point of a framework. It explicitly talks about fossil fuel subsidies and the need to reform them. And we see as well, the IEA recently put out a report, and Fatih Birol, the executive director, commented within that we can only get to net zero commitments if there is no further investment in fossil fuel production. So no further investment upstream in coal, in oil and gas from now. And of course, it makes no sense at all within that sort of environment to have any subsidies to coal and oil and gas mining, to exploration and production. Those subsidies need to go now. So the revision of the Energy Tax Directive, we think, gives a perfect opportunity to really think about pricing energy for net zero, getting rid of the subsidies and moving to tax things such that they reflect the pollution that is caused and the problems that are caused by fossil fuels. We've heard about sort of one particular case today of needing particular attention, which is the fishery subsidies negotiations, which are down to conclude at the WTO on July the 15th, so the day after the Energy Tax Directive. And then there are a whole set of other subsidies to customers. Some of those are covered by the Energy Tax Directive, so great opportunity now to think about these and start getting rid of them. And others are in member state policy. And there we could really say, the time for action is now. There's been commitments by the G20 and the G7 saying that we must reform inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term. Those commitments were made often in 2009. It's clearly we've gone beyond the medium term now. These subsidies are inconsistent with net zero. They're inconsistent with Paris. They're inconsistent with the EU's 55% target, and they need to be reformed as soon as is possible. Some of them will need some other packages put in around support measures to the vulnerable consumers and communities, but that can all be done. And I think through that, then the EU will be able to take up the role that it's played in so many other climate change conversations about being in the lead and showing by example the way forward to the rest of the world. It's a role that the EU has not been able to do so far, and it's a role that's really missing, and we'd like to see them on that path sooner rather than later. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peter. So Peter has also helped us showing the extent of the fossil fuel subsidies in Europe and the EU's role, how the ETD, the Energy Tax Directive's revision, can help EU play a real leadership role at international level through various negotiations as well. So thank you so much. This was the end of the presentations, and the panel is all open now for questions. And yes, getting already hands up. Yes, Angelo.
Yes, thank you. Angelo Di Mambro from ANSA, Italian news agency. I was wondering if you, the EU leaders in July, if I'm not wrong, invited explicitly the Commission to expand the ETS, the emissions trading system, to maritime transport and aviation. Those are two sectors that are heavily subsidized, as we have seen today. I was wondering if you have assessed the combined impact of eliminating the fossil fuel subsidies and expanding the emission trading system to those sectors. Thanks.
I believe Tim can take this question, right?
Well, I can have a stab at it. I think, as you say, Angelo, it's important to see this as a package, and that's how the Commission is approaching it. And one of the big questions of the package is indeed, how will the reform of the ETD sit together with reforms to the energy trading system, both with regard to maritime and shipping, but also on heating and road transport, because there's also likely to be, well, let us see, but quite likely to be a proposal for a new ETS for road transport and heating as well. So they need to make sure these things are working together. And at the moment, of course, the two don't work together. So you have in some member states, you have energy intensive sectors that are eligible for free allowances, nonetheless have to pay higher energy tax rates. And in other member states, they are both exempt or pay much lower energy tax rates, and they get the free allowances. So there's the two are not working together consistently, and that's part of the fragmentation of the energy market, which, as I said, was the initial intent of this directive, was to harmonize and to avoid those competitive distortions. It's clearly not working. So whatever they come up with, those two things need to work together, much more logically. I think, most likely we will continue to see some options for differentiating energy taxes between households and industry. I'm sure that there will be some flexibility that will remain there. But I think the critical thing that is essential, of course, is that the tax rates themselves do reflect at least the carbon content of the fuels in whichever sector, because that's where then at least you can have a consistent price signal on carbon, across the economy, and that's what's missing at the moment. So I think, these questions about exactly how the ETS reforms and new ETS and ETD sit together are absolutely central. We have to look at that carefully and understand how they work. But I think that's a key question for the Commission that they're trying to grapple with, is to make sure that we do have a comprehensive, coherent pricing regime that has a coherent energy carbon price across all of those sectors.
Because the combination of these three makes the price will make the price of CO2. I mean, that's exactly why you're saying the carbon content is the most. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Exactly. So this is a chance to make a coherent, economy-wide carbon price signal. At the moment, you've got about a third of emissions that don't face any carbon price at all in the EU, and then there's a huge differences of the price signal, even where there is some kind of price signal. So you're going to need to kind of get a consistent price across the regime, and that's a huge opportunity. That's a huge part of the prize here of getting this revision right.
Thank you. So David, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. I was just wondering, so we went through the thing, was it 10 years ago there was the proposal, or was it 8 years ago. I've forgotten. Sorry, I arrived late. Maybe you talked about this, and then it was withdrawn in the commission. I can't remember the dates anymore. And then because there was no unanimity, and then this time the commission didn't ask the member states. I don't know the details of it because I haven't followed it in detail, but to shift towards to majority voting QMV, and that they've said no. I don't know in which forum or which format they've said no. But then we're faced with something where one single member state can say no. I was wondering, what's the politics behind all this? Do you really see there's some possibility for the proposal sort of to be made, and then, well, not to be made, but to get through the member states?
Do you want me to have a crack at this one, Elif, and see if others have more to say as well? But yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so that the original proposal for revision was 2011, and it was withdrawn in 2015 for the reasons that you give, that the unanimity couldn't be reached in the council. So what's different? What's likely to be different this time? I think one is that it is part of a package of legislation this time. It isn't just a single directive, and that creates more opportunities for horse trading and package deals for member states, you know, with their interests on other directives. So I think that's a big difference this time around. I think the other big difference, well, obviously there's an even more heightened, I would say, sense of urgency and awareness about the climate crisis now, and the EU is talking about much higher reduction targets. Last time, remember, in 2011, the climate movement was kind of in the doldrums. It was a very difficult period, you know, for advancing climate action. Now, of course, we have much more momentum, not just within the EU, but globally. That will help as well. And I think thirdly, the third kind of factor to take into account here, as I mentioned in my presentation, is that we're seeing movement on tax files that have been stuck forever, essentially. You know, so you've got an administration in the US that is pushing for a minimum corporate tax rate, unheard of, you know, for the last 20 years. You've got movement on the public country by country reporting of corporate tax in the EU, which again is something that NGOs have been talking about for 20 years, hasn't gone anywhere, all of a sudden has moved forward. So even with a topic as difficult, as politically sensitive as tax, we are starting to see, I would say, greater political space for agreements than has ever been the case, at least in the last 10 or 20 years. That will help as well. So you put those things together, and you know, I think there's a much greater chance of that it will go through this time. We know that we'll get a good, I think we will get a strong proposal from the European Commission. We expect them to again align the minimum tax rates, at least with the carbon content of the fuels. Probably they will look to increase the rates gradually over time to phase this in, but the real battle will come at the member state level, and that's where, you know, we'll see that horse trading start to play out.
Before getting the other question from Philip, I'd like to also comment briefly on this question. What is different now is that ETD is extremely old, so it doesn't apply to energy carriers such as hydrogen. It dates back from 2003, so it will need to get revised one way or the other. I think the question is how much teeth can we put in it? So that is more of the question now, because it's the Timmermans cabinet leading on Fit for 55. So this is is part of the climate package, Fit for 55 package, which gives a strong signal. But again, taxation is a matter of national politics. So that's where things get a bit tangled. And maybe a second point that I'd like to add is the whole worry about the post-COVID fiscal crisis that is being awaited, and so alternative revenues are looked for, and tax revenues can play a role. Maybe this is a question because they're a bit unknown at the moment. The information is really opaque from national level. It's hard to get that data, but it would be good to also have an understanding of the scale of tax revenues and how they can be used to support the segments of the society that are most in need of that kind of revenue. Do other colleagues want to add on to this question?
Perhaps just quickly on the revenue side, in the we know when the pandemic hit that the prices of gasoline at the pump went down a lot, you know, often by 30 euro cents a litre or so on around the world. if we had at that point put in an extra tax on gasoline around the world of 12.5 cents, it would have raised $1 billion a day in public revenue. $1 billion a day. These are massive numbers. And we also, we know that there are over 100 billion euros of subsidies to gasoline around the world as well. So there are huge amounts of potential public revenue available here around the world and also in the EU.
Thank you, Peter. Let me have another question from Philip.
Thank you. Two questions, in fact. On the complete exemption for shipping and aviation, is the main political reason behind that, is that international competition? And if so, how do you counter that? Can that only be overcome by international negotiations at the WTO and maybe other fora? Secondly, on fisheries, Flaminia, you said there's a disproportionate benefit for the big fishermen. So do you see the small scale fishermen already, or do you have them as allies already, or is there still much work to be done to convince them? I mean, the fishermen are a big lobby in some member states, France and so on. And well, given that it's an anonymity file, what is the situation there? Thank you.
Flaminia, would you like to get this question?
Yes, concerning, I mean, I'm not an expert on aviation. I know that there is an issue at international level, but that could be sorted, but this, I'm really not an expert, so I cannot really give you details. Concerning the fishers, we are in contact with the low impact fishers of Europe, and they are very much aware of the issue. I think they would agree that the ones who benefit most from subsidies, including fuel subsidies, are the large-scale fleet operating both in EU waters and beyond EU waters, because there is also the whole international distance fleet, let's say. For the moment, I think they are not ready yet to talk openly on fuel subsidies. I mean, other colleagues are here. That's my feeling, but they are suffering already for years about the fact that basically they cannot access they cannot access the subsidies, and when it comes to fuel subsidies, they are not so beneficial for them. So I think in this file there is room for them to maybe aggregate together. The problem is the big voices of the large industry, which are much more organized. And you will probably hear from them that, for example, they have reduced already emissions since the 90s, which is not accurate. And it's because it doesn't take into account what I was talking about, this new study that shows that they are generating emission by dragging their nets on the floor. So I think, yeah, there is still work to be done at the level of the small scale, I would say. But hopefully they will be on board.
Just to add on aviation, yeah, I think it's a good question actually why aviation was exempted back in 2003. But yeah, undoubtedly on competitiveness grounds, or just, I mean, literally just to support the industry, the growth of the industry. But there's nothing that stops. There's nothing at the international level that stops the EU taxing kerosene for aviation even now. So under the current directive, member states can tax their internal flights. I think some of them do that. We'd need to check. And it is possible also to tax flights between member states if you have an agreement between those two member states that say, we agree that we're going to tax flights between these two member states. That doesn't exist as far as I know. There are no such examples, but it is at least legal, even under the current directive. So there's nothing at the international level that prevents the EU taxing flights, at least with intra-EU flights. And that's a step that, you know, I think even the Commission recognises there's really sort of no justification for continuing to allow the aviation sector to free ride, while every other part of the economy increasingly is having to pay some kind of tax, you know, internalize the price in some way. And yet this one sector, which is overwhelmingly used to service the richest parts of society gets away scot-free. So that's just an inconsistency that surely can't last.
And just to add to that quickly, I think this is an excellent question, Philip. And there is increasing attention now around the world about why aren't there more taxes on aviation and shipping? A lot of it goes back to agreements that were made in the 1950s, where international bunker fuels, so fuels outside people's borders, didn't need to be taxed. But there are ways around this, even if countries don't want to put on specific fuel taxes because there are laws against it or there's difficulties in agreements. There's nothing wrong with them with taxing tickets for aviation, for example. You don't have to do it directly through a fuel measure, but you should do it in some way, and there are options available. So, for those who are saying this is impossible because of previous agreements, it's not. We might have to get a little bit creative, but it's possible.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands in the chat box, so I'd like to ask people to step in if there are any other questions from the journalists. Okay, if not, then thank you so much for joining, and you will receive the recording of this press conference together with a media pack from our colleagues Dave and Diane very soon in your inboxes. And you can also reach out to them if you have other questions, specific questions that we couldn't answer today. We're happy to answer those questions later on as well. Thank you so much and have a nice rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.